thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. Thank you so much for joining us on this Global Policy to Local Action web meeting. My name is Akiko Maeda, and I'm a member of the TUFH network, member of the board as well. It's a great pleasure to have you, and thank you. Today, what we wanted to do was to do some shared thinking, and rather than myself give you my own perspectives on things as such, I'd rather have you think about the questions, and at the end of this session we hope that we'll have at least some beginnings of an agreed focal areas and how we can start to address some of these very thorny, difficult issues that we have all been grappling with in our different areas and positions. Just very briefly, I am a health economist by profession, over 30 years in international development, but I was originally trained as a biochemist and a biophysicist, which did give me some different perspectives. And the questions I've had working for 30 years in international development was, how come with all that effort, we are not able to find solutions together? I have particularly worked mainly at the national and global levels, more at the macro level. But of course, we worry about the perspectives of our clients, our individual patients, communities, and we talked a lot, but we could not make a connection that worked. Somewhere along the lines, we'd end up having to go very aggregated and very macro and lose the definitions, the subtleties at the individual level, or we go down to the individual level, do detailed analysis, and then we can't seem to figure out how it connects at the macro level. Why are we having so much trouble connecting at different levels? We find the same problems over and over again, and I've seen so many discussions, we are not finding the right solutions. It's one of the reasons why I left working with the World Bank to reflect and think and to re-educate myself. What is it that we're doing wrong? What do we need to do, retrain ourselves? And so it's in that spirit that I joined the TUFH network. And I hope that as we go through our discussion today and listen to the presentation from our guest speaker, we will have an opportunity to learn and ask questions in a different way. And particularly in a world where we become highly specialized in our own areas, where there's so much information that we don't have the capacity, our brain capacity to take in more, there must be other ways in which we could find a solution. And this is where I personally think that we need to get more familiar with complex systems analysis and how we need to train ourselves to think that way. And I do think this will help us to move forward in reconnecting across different levels. But that's my personal view, and you may have other opinions. And it will be a great opportunity for us to think and reflect, and hopefully come out with some new insights in different ways in how we analyze problems, but also how do we share and communicate our perspectives for a more richer and more effective solutions as we face so many global problems today. So with that brief framing and introduction, what I would like to do is to have each of you introduce yourselves briefly about yourself and your background and your interests. And as we have more than 20 people, what I will do is just go through each of your names of the participants and have you introduce yourselves. But maybe we should start with our...
Can we start with Lionel as the co-chair?
Oh, Lionel. Sorry, Lionel. Thank you. Lionel, sorry, over to you.
I'm not quite sure where everybody is in terms of time frames, but my name is Lionel Green-Thompson. I see Stuart there, so hello, Stuart. Yeah, I think that, so my background is really trying to look at a medical school, a school of medicine, to try and work out the extent to which the social accountability interface begins to address some of these problems. So I think this conversation is important because we must, I'm sensing that there's a lot of thought about how things should be done. But I think that what the complexity paradigm offers is to begin to see the interconnectedness of the various levels. So for me, the real challenge is how, even at a national level, how do we build the capacity to link up as different schools to enhance what we do in an individual local level? So currently I'm dean at a school at a South African School of Medicine. And that remains our tension, is trying to find ways of translating global thinking into local realities and vice versa, because I think there are things that we can learn from what we're doing at the local level and translate into the bigger society. So thanks, Akiko, that we can share the chairing of this discussion. Yeah, that's me. So everybody else can go ahead and say who they are.
Okay, thank you. So since there are many of us, maybe I'm just going down the list of participants who are on the call. So may I start with Vince Blazer? Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, this is Vince Blazer. I'm the Senior Policy Advisor at IntraHealth International, an NGO, and Director of the Frontline Health Workers Coalition, which is a coalition of 42 US-based organizations working on advocacy on frontline health workforce in low and middle income countries. I think that this is a really great conversation because, and as the last speaker mentioned, I think the two-way communication is what's really important. I think we often talk about trying to get global policies down to the local level, which is very important, but I'm really in trying to create concrete pathways for health workers and other providers to really inform global and national policies on a regular basis, and then not in a token way, I think is really important. So look forward to discussing that further this morning.
Thank you, Vince. Next is Ala Defala. Please forgive me if I mispronounce your name. Ala Defala.
No, that's perfectly fine. And yes, hi everyone, my name is Ala. I'm from the International Federation for Medical Students Associations. Our interest in this topic today is because our general motto is to think globally and act locally, but we found ourselves struggling in a place where we're having a lot of global advocacy, but wishing to strengthen local action, especially when it comes to topics such as social accountability and strengthening local medical education systems to address international global problems. So this is exactly why I'm here today, and I'm looking forward to a very fruitful discussion.
Thank you, it's great.
And I'm a medical student in my final year.
Okay, thank you, that's wonderful. Then it's our good friend Aricia. Aricia, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, my name is Aricia de Kempeneer. I'm a Belgian midwife. I've done my master's degree in health promotion at the University of Ghent. I think the topic today is key, especially since I've been involved with the network for a number of years. I've seen the impact of local community actions and local projects, but then looking at it in a global or international context and how we can make sure that what works somewhere could be implemented somewhere else, or if it doesn't work, maybe figure out a new way altogether and how we can make something work. So I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Alicia. Next, Barbara Maxwell, over to you.
Hi there. I'm Barbara Maxwell. I'm with AT Still University in the US, and also I'm the US representative to Interprofessional.global, Global Confederation for Interprofessional Education and Collaboration. And my interest in it is I happen to co-lead the global policy working group for that organization, and the whole notion of needing some global movement to make some local change is very, very real. And I also happen to be a a member of Ramesses and the US Network for Realist Evaluation. And so the notion of how to evaluate complex systems is very much the nature of what we do as realist evaluators. And so knitting the two together for me is, I'm hoping today that will really fit within that little window of how to influence local action through global policy.
Thank you. That's great. Then it's Dr. Pratyush Kumar.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Pratyush Kumar, and I'm from a young family doctor from India. I basically work in rural areas, and along with Bruce Chatter and Roger Strasser, we are leading the rural task force of the network. And we are really interested about this policy to local action because rural health is something very dear to all of us, and rural population are going to be most affected with the global policies if it doesn't talk about the rural health priorities, and if it still widens the gap in terms of finances, inequity, like health workforce shortage. So we need to really look forward that whether the global policy which we are making, whether it meets the demand of our rural population or not. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Emily Dutka.
This is Emily Dudka, and I'm here with Taylor. I'm the Chief of Staff here supporting the great work of the network.
Thank you, Emily. Next, Geneviève Moineau. Jenny?
Yes, hello. I am with the Association of Faculties of Medicine of Canada, based in Ottawa, and we are very committed to the social accountability of faculties of medicine in Canada. And in particular, our focus currently is on accreditation as a lever or a driver for that to move us forward in social accountability. And we've had the privilege of working with and sharing with many countries and through PAHO as well, and believe that through this work we can actually have a significant effect on local action. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Glenda Eoyang.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here today. I'm the Executive Director of the Human Systems Dynamics Institute. And since the late 1980s, I've been working at the intersection of complexity science and human systems. And today we're working to apply this question about global, high-scale continuity and coherence with local variability in a variety of contexts, leadership and learning and evaluation and healthcare, social accountability, social justice in various contexts. And so I'm very excited to see the framing that you have this question. So I'm happy to be with you today.
Thank you. Then we have Jeanette Mladenovic. Jeanette, I think your mute is on. Hello, Jeanette? We're not able to hear you. If not, we'll move towards Jean Edwards.
Hi, good morning. I'm Jennifer Edwards with the National Network of Public Health Institutes. We are a member organization of public health institutes focused on public health structures, systems, and outcomes. And we primarily have public health institutes as our members, as well as some affiliates. And my personal area of expertise is qualitative research. and I have special interests as well in applied measurement strategy. So thank you for having us on the call, and I look forward to speaking with everyone.
That's great, thank you. John Wynne Jones.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello, hi. Thank you very much for asking me to join you. My name is John Wynne Jones. I'm my background is a family physician in a rural area in Wales. I also am a senior lecturer in global health at Keele Medical School. But for the last 6 years, I've been the chair of the rural part of WONCO, the World Organization of Family Doctors. My focus, the same as Dr. Pratish, is about rural. We're talking today about how we make a difference in local, but I think we have a central problem as well, in the sense that although access to health care in rural areas is extremely uneven compared with urban areas, and we're talking about 23% of the world's urban population don't have access to health care. Well, it's getting on for 50% of the world's rural population. It's worse in certain places. So it's about influencing policy at the top as well as actually making that work at the bottom. One would have thought with those discrepancies that the Astana Declaration would have actually highlighted rural issues. We had to fight incredibly hard to get rural into it. Wow. So I think from a rural perspective, it's a no-brainer for me. If we're going to get universal health coverage, we've actually got to crack the rural issue. And it's not about quality, it's about equity. And it's about making those differences that's going to change. So that's why I'm here today and looking forward to discussion.
Thank you. Mary Shostark, next.
Yes, hi, my name is Mary Shostark. I'm a physician assistant. I actually live in Miami Beach, Florida, but I work for Yale School of Medicine Physician Assistant online program. So to address some of the rural issues, our program is an online program, and we have students who are across the US in rural areas to train them in healthcare. I'm also the Director of New Development for Physician Assistants for Global Health, as well as with a liaison to EuroPAC, which is working on standards and accreditations for the physician assistant profession in Europe, as well as an ambassador to the American Academy of Physician Assistants as their global ambassador. With that, we hope to share policy information on how American Academy of PAs were able to implement laws in 50 different US states and help other areas and ministries, where I went to an excellent meeting that William Burdick hosted in Istanbul, and I saw Nick there and met a lot of different people from different ministries and different countries, where we helped to address those issues that John was talking about for the physician assistant profession, which we exist on 56 different countries with 14 different names. So we hope to, and that's what I'd like to learn more about and learn how we can get the universal healthcare coverage. And also I work a lot with interprofessional education with Barbara Maxwell and Nick Torres. So thank you.
Thank you. Next, Raymond Yuan.
Hi, it's Ricia here. Raymond is currently unavailable to speak. He is my colleague working at the Office of the Secretariat in Philadelphia, but his setup has him on mute, sorry.
Okay, all right, thank you. And then we have next, Shion Seno. Hope I pronounced it correctly.
Yes, hello, thank you so much for having me. I'm currently a liaison in Japan for an NGO, Global Citizen. It's based in New York, but I am based in Japan. I've worked primarily across global health issues at Global Citizen, but right now I'm kind of branching into my own little think tank where we're working across healthcare issues within and outside Japan, and especially focusing on health system strengthening in Nepal in a partnership with Japanese entities. That's how I was connected to Dr. Sugishita, who kindly invited me for this call. I'm very excited to learn from all of you, because I think as many of the participants have already addressed, a lot of the global policies have great practices that I believe are useful when considering how to implement them locally, but they really require a lot of local effort to implement and realize And I would love to learn from everyone who's working on that at the forefront. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for joining. And continuing the Japanese theme, Sugishita Sensei, Tomohiko Sugishita next. It's good to
Thank
hear
you, Akiko-san. I'm very happy to work with you again. So my name is Tomohiko Sugishita, is a teaching global health at Tokyo Women's Medical University. My background is a cardiovascular surgeon, as well as a medical anthropologist working in Africa more than 25 years. And also I'm working for JICA, Special Global Health Advisor to Japan International Cooperation Agency, JICA. Has been extensive work for more than 200 projects in the world. But I'm really hoping to kind of really connect the global context and the local context. Especially my focus is the cultural understanding of the illness and sickness, and also value-based health systems, especially adopted by like design thinking, social design, how we can design for the future as a sustainable planet. So that is my concern. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Great. Next, we have Trevor Gibbs.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone, or good day, depending on whereabouts you are in the world. My name is Trevor Gibbs. I'm president of AMI. My background has been as a general practitioner in the UK for many years, but for the last 20 years, I've been working with AMI in delivering faculty development programs to many parts of the world, many of them to resource-constrained areas. I admit freely that I'm very passionate about faculty development because I believe that good faculty development eventually leads to good health. I would reiterate what Lionel said very early, that faculty development and all activities in different countries should be a two-way process. But sadly, that doesn't always happen. It's very often a one-way process. And part of this discussion, I hope, will enlighten me how to make it much more of a two-way process. We very often hope at AMI that our conferences will be part of that, but in fact, sadly, they're not always that because of restraint, financial restraint and political restraint from many parts of the world actually, that need faculty development. So I'm hoping that I get some good ideas and start mixing with people going to make this a two-way process. Thank you.
Thank you. Bill Burdick, William Burdick.
Hi, Bill Burdick. Great to be here. Sorry I was a few minutes late. I'm Vice President for Education at FAMR, and it's good to see a few faces that I saw last week. Hi, Mary and others. So we hosted a wonderful meeting last week on workforce accreditation and regulation. And one of the challenges is to sustain that community of folks interested in accreditation and regulation. That's something I'm working on right now. Thanks, Akiko.
Thank you. Thank you, Bill. And then we have two more persons. Yassine El Hussein. Yassine, you're on mute. Okay, maybe he's not there. Yassine, okay. Hello? Okay. Next we have Candice.
I'm Yassine Al Hussein.
Yassine, are you
I'm
there?
representing the Student Network Organization.
Oh, sorry, your voice is breaking.
Akiko, if he's not able to speak, I can quickly introduce him. He's
Yes.
Yassine Al Hussein. He is the president of the Student Network Organization. He's a medical student.
And organizing body with the network TUFH itself. It's my pleasure to attend today a global discussion and an important thing regarding and organizing body with the network TUFH itself. It's my pleasure.
Sorry, Yassine, you're breaking up. Sorry we can't hear your voice, but I guess Alicia was briefly introducing you on your behalf.
Yes, so the current president of the Student Network Organization, and he is a medical student from Sudan, and he does have some connection issues with the Sudanese region as he has just dropped. But he is doing a great job, and alongside the other Student Network Organization members.
Great. Thanks, Alicia, on behalf of Yassine. And then last but not least, of course, Candice Chen. Candice, would you like to introduce yourself? Yours, yeah.
Can you hear me?
Now we can, yes.
Okay, sorry. Hello, everybody. I am Candice Chen. I am based in Washington, D.C. in the United States in the recently renamed Fitzhugh Mullen Institute for Health Workforce Equity. I run something called the Beyond Flexner Alliance, which is a largely domestically U.S.-focused movement and organization to advance social mission and health professions education. Social mission, I think, very similar. We use very similar to the social accountability that other people have mentioned. And where you started about how to connect all the different levels that people work at, from on the ground to all the way up to global policy, really spoke to me. One of the things that we're doing right now is we're planning our big national meeting, which does pull global participants as well. We expect more than 600 people. We're actually partnering with A.T. Still University in their Arizona campus. And, it's an opportunity for innovators within different health professions education. We are interprofessional to come and share their innovations, to connect. But one of the other things that we really try to do is to educate, highlight policy, system level and policy level issues, and provide an opportunity for people to come together to start to plan and address those issues. We're really excited about the global connection, the connection to TUFH as well, because I think we recognize that many U.S. institutions are partnering globally, and there's, I think, some recognition that there's some work to do there on how we partner. But then there's also just the opportunity to learn from each other, and then again to collaborate and partner to move forward global policies. And just really quickly, background-wise, I'm a pediatrician, but a health workforce HRH researcher, mostly focused on the U.S., but previously we did work in sub-Saharan Africa, looking at medical schools, something called the Medical Education Partnership Initiative. Before that, the Sub-Saharan African Medical School Study. So excited to be a part of this.
Great. Well, thank you so much, everybody. I think we have quite a diverse range of people from different countries, different backgrounds, different focus. So this should be a very exciting discussion. And as was mentioned, this is not a one-off issue. We hope that this will become a start of a continuing dialogue and learning experience. So we're absolutely on time. Did I miss anybody? I have gone through everybody on the list, but let me know if there's somebody who still hasn't spoken yet, apart from the presenter and Nick, who have yet to introduce themselves. If not, okay. Well, we're right on time to now move to the special presentation for today on what is a complex system thinking by Stuart Menon. If I may ask you, Stuart, to introduce yourself first before we launch into your presentation. So over to you, Stuart.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Good, thank you. Well, I'm delighted to be with such a knowledgeable and experienced group. I'm Stuart Menon. I'm speaking to you from Sao Paulo, Brazil. I've been here for the last 15 years, working here and around the world. And I'm delighted to be reconnected with the network. My first experience with the network was in 1985 in Ismailia. And I worked with the network all the way through 2000. And I have lots of experience with it over the years. And I've also worked quite a bit with the Famer Institute, my colleague Bill Burdick, and I have collaborated on many productive collaborations with many fellows, and I've watched FAMER Institute grow and expand and influence around the world. And I'm delighted to be with all of you. And my colleague, Glenda Oyoung, is also with us today. And what I would like to do is I will share screen with you, and I have a short presentation that will address, hopefully, the major issues that have been raised about how we can work globally and locally and make the connections and how it influences faculty development. So I've titled this talk, Hope is Not a Strategy, because it takes more than hope to get things together. You can bring people together and then try to sustain what may happen or try to scale what happens. But unless we have a specific strategy that recognizes the reality, both on the ground, in the middle, and at the global level, we need more than that. And so today I want to use human systems dynamics to close the gap between local action and global policy. And I will explain more about what that is. And my goal today, hang on just 1 second. My goal today is to answer 2 questions. How can global health policy be put into action in multiple contexts and still preserve the overall coherence of the policy? And how does local action utilize its sensitivity to local and global constraints and still be coherent with locations at other sites and with global policy? I think this is the central question that has been raised by many of you as we move along. And so to have specific objectives for this talk, that during this talk and after this talk, you'll be able to recognize and give examples of simple, complicated, and complex patterns, because it's patterns that we need to move to. We need to move from a perspective of individual events to patterns of events over time. And I will define complexity as simply as possible. And then we will discuss the underlying dynamics of complexity thinking. And that is pattern logic. So if patterns are central to complexity, then the logic of patterns, which is different than the logic model and other kinds of linear logics, is essential for us to be able to use complexity useful and make it work for us. And that also includes a model called this CDE model. And then to get towards action, I will discuss 4 things that influence wicked problems or complex patterns. And finally, indicate how adaptive action makes complexity of wicked problems actionable. It's a tall order, and I will go fast, and I hope that this will work well. So first of all, I want to say that there's many different kinds of patterns. There's art, there's design, there's architecture, there's dance, there's sewing, there's music, there's healthcare, health policy, all kinds of different patterns. And when we look at patterns, we want to understand them in different ways. And so one of the ways to understand patterns is that there are patterns that are simple. For example, taking vital signs or answering a single multiple choice question. There's a right answer, there's a right procedure, there's a best practice in these kinds of patterns. Then there are patterns that are more complicated. They're more variable, they're less predictable, like conducting a vaccination program for school children. And these kinds of patterns are variable and complicated, but there's still fixed procedures that you can carry out. And then there's patterns that are complex. And what does that mean? So if we look at the pattern of a physician with a patient, it's not a fixed protocol that's repeated every time. It unfolds in real time and it's dynamical. There's discussion, there's relationship. When we look at the pattern of a community health worker working with a family or a pair of families in a rural community, or if we look at a pregnancy unfolding with a patient over time, these are complex patterns. And the way we define complex patterns is that they have similarity, differences, and relationships that have meaning across space and time. So if you look at the village health workers and the families, there are similarities between people in the family, and there are differences. And there are similarities and differences between this family and other families. And there are relationships, and all of these things are moving across time. So it's very hard to pin them down in a fixed time and space. It's the movement across time and space that makes complex patterns so difficult to deal with traditional methods. So it's very important that we focus on patterns. And I want to compare simple, complicated, and complex patterns. And the way we compare them is to look at the complexity of things. Complex thinking looks at parts. There are many, many parts. There are too many parts. How they interact over time and space. And over time, patterns emerge from that interaction. And so if we look at patterns and we use the family in this local village as an example, what we see is that simple and complicated patterns are cause and effect, that they're directly proportional. Input, output, and outcomes are directly proportional. Whereas complex problems, cause and effect, are not linear. They don't allow themselves for direct cause and effect. The outcomes are emergent. And simple and complicated patterns have clear boundaries. You start a procedure, you end a procedure. You begin a project, you end a project. Whereas with complex problems and complex patterns, the boundaries are shifting. They're uncertain. You may have one complex situation co-embedded inside another complex situation, embedded in another one. And so it's hard to discern where exactly the boundary begins and ends. In simple and complex situations like taking blood pressure, there's a beginning and an end. Whereas in family health, working with a village, there's no clear beginning or end. It just goes on. Where in a simple and complicated pattern, there's specific and stable rules. This is where you put the blood pressure cuff. This is the one right answer to a multiple choice question. There are standards and measurements and outcomes that we hold to. We need these. We have to have them. However, in a complex problem like family health or rural concerns, there are unstable rules, changing standards and measurements locally. In simple and complicated situations, there's a well-defined top-down hierarchy. There's a attending physician, there's a resident, there's students, there's fourth-year students, third-year students. The hierarchy is well established, whereas working with complex problems, there's a top-down and a bottom-up. And it's hard to stay with one or the other. You need both. So it's top-down and bottom-up. In complex problems, in simple problems, there's a solution, there's a right answer. This expertise is valuable. We need expertise, we need right answers. And this is best practice, this is evidence-based practice. Whereas with complex problems, there's no right answer or fixed solution. You can't take a solution from one place and put it in another place. And under these conditions, questions and inquiry is the best practice. And finally, in a very simplistic way, simple and complex situations can be replicated. They're precise, they're stable, they're reliable. And we need reliability, we need precision. There's a huge portion of healthcare that depends on replication. There's a huge aspect of health professions education that wants to replicate prior knowledge and learning. And then there are situations that are unpredictable and they're filled with surprise and innovation. So the comparison between simple and complex is quite different. And it's very clear that simple and complicated patterns and the working with them does not work with complex situations. So what happens many times is that people try to apply simple and complicated solutions to complex problems, and it doesn't work. And you heard in the introductions from everyone how we seem to be unable to bridge the patterns locally and globally, or that making connections between these things is difficult. And that's because we're using a set of logics and thinking that work really, really well with simple and complicated problems, but not at all in complex problems. And the issue then is to learn the logic and the work of complex problems. And when complex problems arise, they arise through parts, interactions, and patterns. Remember our definition of complexity. A large number of parts held together and interacting so that over time and space, patterns emerge. And the patterns have complex qualities from this table. So the problems that arise are wicked problems, and wicked problems are complex patterns. A wicked problem is any situation that causes difficulties for which there's no obvious available and known solution. Any problem that's extremely intractable and massively entangled and complex. So wicked problems are complex, but not all complex patterns are wicked. So we are concerned with the problems that arise in wicked problem situations and complex problems of parts, interactions, and patterns, our definition of complexity. And so it's really important that we understand the logic of complex patterns. And I want to take some time to now go into what is the fundamental logic that is not cause and effect. So how does the logic of complex pattern work? And how does it affect our thinking about wicked problems? How can we make complexity useful? How can we make complexity actionable? How can we apply complexity to the problems that we began talking about? The first thing I want to mention is that there are three components to complex problem logic. And the first component is called the container, and that is the parts that are interacting in a complex system are held together in a container. And the container holds the parts together. And it holds the parts together so that they can interact. And it holds parts together because there's similarities amongst the parts. So many of us here today are interested in health education and health practice. That similarity holds us together. Many of us here online are involved with the network or other organizations that are networking. And a network is an idea, a belief, a system of rules and behavior that holds people together to work together. And that's functionally a container, as if we were inside. And each one of these parts could be a different organization that's online with us here today. They could also be members of a family that are involved with the health worker in a community. It could be departments, different departments in a medical school. It could be a hospital, it could be a community. This could be a different community. This could be a policy, another policy. This could be a different country. All of these parts that have a shared belief, a system, a set of rules are held together by a container. So a container holds the parts together. The differences between the parts create a sense of energy and tension that can be exchanged and released through interaction. So container, difference, and exchange are the fundamental features of a complex problem and a complex pattern. And so it's not the same as cause and effect because this all interacts in a nonlinear way. So what we say is pattern logic, or the logic of patterns, involves containers, differences, and exchanges. So we have many, many parts held together by a container, this blue line, and they interact with each other in nonlinear ways over time and space so that patterns emerge. And the patterns are represented here as ellipses, and one is embedded in the other. And so we see that as agents interact, system-wide patterns emerge. The key point here is that from local agents, interactions in the shared system of beliefs and rules, system-wide patterns emerge. And once those system-wide patterns emerge, they then influence the agents in future interactions. So the logic of complex adaptive systems, of complex patterns, and the logic of wicked problems has to do with parts being held together, being different than each other, sharing differences, communicating, working together, and over time, patterns emerge. And they emerge by a specific process called self-organization, which I'm not going to speak to in this presentation today because this is very abbreviated. So what can we actually do about complex problems? What can we actually physically do on the ground? Here are 4 things we can do specifically to make this actionable, to apply to projects, to apply to policies. 4 things we can do with wicked problems and complex problems. The first thing is called set minimal requirements. These are like global standards, if you will. So a minimal requirement, for example, could be put the family first. Here we have a community health worker, and let's take an example. Let's say this is a vaccination program in this village for measles. Measles is really important right now, and I'm going to use measles and vaccination as a specific example in the rest of this talk because I can't go into other examples due to time. Measles vaccination is important because maybe some of these kids are not vaccinated. If the health worker puts the family first, if the family puts the family first, if the local village puts families first, if the regional health system puts families first, if the national policy puts families first in all its decisions and all its policies, so whenever a decision comes up, the first thing they say is, what about the family? How does this affect the family? And the global policy does this by taking a set of minimal requirements, such as one being family first, and using it, we can link across all global to local. The second thing you can do is don't pretend to know what's happening on the ground. When you have so many individual villages and so many individual countries and so many different places, there's no way that you can actually know what's going on the ground at any 1 minute. So instead of trying to measure and set specific requirements for everybody, you set general requirements, such as minimal requirements, that support local inquiry and innovation. And it makes it possible to know what's happening on the ground by examining the minimal requirements rather than collecting specific points of data and then trying to put them together. Excuse me. A process called adaptive action, which we'll talk about in a moment, makes complexity actionable. So looking on the ground for patterns, on the ground, every context is different. Every family is different, every village is different, every region is different, every country is different, context is everything. However, when you set minimal requirements, the minimal requirements cross contexts and work in context at the same time. And this is the beauty of understanding pattern logic in complexity. Pattern logic allows you to look at minimal requirements, such as put the family first. It works for every village health worker. It works everywhere. And you can look across the whole arc of putting the family first in every context and see the whole pattern. The third thing is to pay attention to the middle scale. In a global policy is top down and local action is bottom up. And very significant to the network's challenge and all the challenges mentioned earlier is to bridge the top and the bottom. And you do this by looking in the middle ground, a middle scale between large global and local scales. Time is up. And actors in the middle scale always follow the same minimal requirements. And this scale could be national, it could be regional, it could be an NGO or a community action group. By identifying and leveraging structures and stories and narratives in the middle scale, the system moves towards coherence between local, middle, and global. And so that's the thing that connects the top and the bottom. And finally, you can evaluate by looking for shifts in patterns rather than only changes in numbers. So we look for, there's no simple evaluation and no single invaluable measure in a wicked complex pattern, because everything is nonlinear and you don't know what's going to be important in the next moment. It's not possible to predict what's going to happen. So instead, you wait and see and look for shifts in patterns at any accessible scale. Valuable information is gained when patterns and structures and stories in the middle scale are leveraged to link with global and local actions. So finally, to make all of this actionable, we use a simple 3-step protocol called adaptive action. And this is really easy to use at every scale by everyone. It consists of 3 questions: what, so what, and now what. And this works in clinical medicine, it works in research, it works everywhere. And it's the simplest approach to all of this. And it's like Kolb's learning cycle. It's even simpler than that, and very deep and has a strong theoretical foundation. You ask what? What is the discovery process? What's the patient have to say? What's going on in the village? You describe the patterns you see and the patterns you want to see. So you ask, what do you know? It's very common in health professions and community work. What patterns do you see? You're able to describe patterns because you know the difference between simple, complicated, and complex. What surprises you? What interests you the most? What? And there are many more questions, and because of time, I won't go through them. So what is discovery? And we know how to do this. The next question that we ask is, so what does it mean, what we have discovered? It takes us to understanding. It's very much like the 1-minute preceptor. Understanding means explaining interdependencies, implications of patterns. What does a pattern mean? How can you identify, frame, and select viable options for action in a complex pattern? So you ask, what's important here? What are the implications of this? So what is working now? What does it mean? This is a way to understand what's going on. And when you understand what you're seeing, then you're able to take action. And action provides a way to contribute to the change that you seek. So you say, as a result of the meaning I have just made, what will I do right now? What can I do next? What will I communicate? Now what will I measure? Now what action is most likely to help? Now what will you look for? Now what does success look like? These are all familiar questions. There's nothing new and secretive about this. What's different is that these work in complex patterns. These questions will allow you to unravel a complex narrative and a complex situation. And what, so what, and now what is the way to make complexity actionable. You can unravel complexity. These 3 questions are consistently useful at all scales. So it bridges global and local and middle. And it allows you to manage wicked problems and expresses the logic of patterns. And it allows you to turn complex patterns into possibilities of action and possibilities into options for action. So to conclude, progress in life and in science is not a simple line leading to the truth. It's more like progress away from less adequate conceptions of and interactions with the world. And so what we need to do is shift from linear thinking to complex nonlinear thinking, using wicked problems managed by human systems dynamics, complexity thinking that involve inquiry, pattern logic, and adaptive action. So I want to thank you for your patience. This has been a very fast tour through complexity thinking. So the way to do this is to keep learning and to keep going. And I appreciate very much this opportunity. And with that, I will stop and turn it back to the moderator.
Thank you very much, Stuart. We look forward to our discussions on these from everyone. I'd like to first, before we do that, turn to Nick. Nick, would you like to introduce yourself also and say a few words about the TUFH Network's strategy on this?
Just happy to be here with everyone. Welcome. TUFH is trying to serve its mission of being a network of network and connecting different regions globally. Akiko, do you want me to launch into a little bit of the network strategy, or did you want to do Q&A first?
Yeah, perhaps what we would like, we go into a deeper discussion, is to give people who may have some quick questions and for clarification on Stuart's presentation. So if you'd like to raise your hand and let's just see who, anybody? So Nick,
yeah.
can you manage?
Yeah.
I see on my screen.
Yeah.
Anybody's raising their hand.
Go ahead, Pratush.
Yeah, but I just wanted to ask one question that we have learned that this policy over past so many years, there have been many global policies, and we have also failed to achieve the mission objectives and the goals. And one of the most common cause which have come is that there is lack of independent accountability. that even after all those things, who will be made accountable of all those things, and how we look for those things, and who should be made accountable to that. So an independent accountability into these global policies to local implementation or local action is something we need to look for. So I'd like to have his views on independent accountabilities on global policies.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Stuart. Over to you.
Yes, independent accountability is really important, and shared values and shared goals in a global policy and shared minimal requirements is what's required. Minimal requirements are not set by somebody in the office somewhere. Minimum requirements are determined collectively. So all the people involved are involved in setting up the minimal requirements. And there's usually 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 minimal requirements at the most. And they involve all aspects of pattern logic. So you have container differences and exchange of minimal requirements, and they affect everyone. So everyone independently can look at the minimum requirements and say, to what extent are we achieving these? How is this pattern working out? What patterns are we seeing? And you can all look independently at local levels, and you can look at mid-levels and global levels and still see the same thing. Glenda, do you want to add something to this from your perspective? My colleague Glenda Oyoung is online. If you want to add something to the answer to this question, I would welcome that.
Thank you, Stuart. I appreciate the question. And one of the things that we recognize is that if individuals and mid-tier global levels are accountable to these minimum specifications, that they can be reinterpreted depending on where someone is, what their context is, where they are in the system. So the accountability, rather than being accountable to policy, individuals and institutions become accountable to these minimum specifications that are infinitely various as well. So it shifts the question. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else with a question for?
Barbara has her hand up. Barbara, okay. You want to go?
Yes, my comment is about the so what question. So thinking about approaches to really gaining understanding. And so I'm putting my realist evaluation hat on right now. In exploring the so what and understanding what's really happening. I think there's a great position there for realist evaluation approaches, because the questions that are asked in those, and they're used for complex adaptive systems or complex adaptive interventions, and the questions that are asked are what works, for whom, in which context, in which respects, and why. And so when you get to that part of really trying to do the so what and gain that understanding of what's happening, that appreciation of context, I loved your comment about context, because context really is the game changer. The contextual elements are what shapes one intervention or approach or plan or policy from being a marvelous success in one area and being an ultimate disaster in another. And so I wondered if you'd, in your own work or the work of others, you'd seen realist evaluation used to try to really address that so what question.
Let's get Bill Burdick also wants to say something before we turn it back to you, Stuart, for a comment. Bill?
Yeah, I was just reminded, Stuart and Glenda, of the concept of minimal standards is almost like consensus about values, or another way to say it is determining values, which is something that sort of cultures do. They sort of figure out and get consensus about their cultures. Often, about their values, I mean, often those values in a culture are unrecognized assumptions And so making them explicit is important. The other piece that I was reminded of, Stuart, is that so much of this issue around complex problems is about the notion of people and the human interaction. And that's where things get messy, and that's where things get difficult, because humans are very multifaceted, complicated. They've got many different, often competing or contradictory values, and communicating to establish or recognize those values is not easy in many cases. So I emphasized this at the meeting last week in Turkey, and I continue to emphasize it, and that is that in order to move forward and make progress, it's all about social interaction and creating intentional ways to amplify, create, amplify, and nurture those relationships. And for those of us, and I think this is most of us, who are inherently shy people, it requires some kind of structured, often explicit exercise to create those bonds and those relationships.
Akiko?
Yes, following up on that, I think since I'm an economist, I think one of the most helpful development in recent years is the introduction of behavioral sciences and behavior economics, which gets at the issue of human behavior, understanding the human tendencies. You were talking about having a common minimum requirements, but there are certain tendencies in human behavior, the patterns are unrecognized biases, subliminal biases, all these things, wanting to socialize. I think these are critical elements, because I understand it would be critical, because we're dealing with conflicts, with power differentials, and finding a way, a consensus around that is the skill and understanding that we need in order to deal with these complex problems. So I just wondered, following on Bill's comments, what your thinking is on bringing in much more of the behavior psychological sciences in addressing the specific problem of human and social interactions into complex problem solving. Thank you.
Trevor, we'll give you the last word before we turn it over back to Stuart for some final thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. Following on from Bill's comments, I think we also have to recognize the cultural variations. And I know Stuart and I have had long discussions about this, from a society which has very vertical, hierarchical cultural interactions to one that has very horizontal intersocial interactions. And I think we just need to recognize that that is another complex issue that adds to the dynamics.
I think it's really important what people are saying, and I thank everyone. What Bill mentioned and what Trevor enforced and others enforced is really critical, that this is essentially a human interaction issue. And human systems dynamics is at the interface of social human interaction and the biological and physical world. It's where the two come together. And I think Bill's that it's really important that we talk about culture, because culture is a really good example of something that's both global, mid-level, and local. Within any given culture, you have infinite variations of that culture, yet it's still recognizable as that culture by language, by art, by tradition, by rules. And you have shared values that make that culture stay together even over generations. And the differences between people help to reinforce that culture. The similarities hold the people in it, and the differences help to keep it vital through exchanges and interactions and reinterpretations. And so culture is a really good example of the human complexities involved. And you could think of it as global, mid-level, and local. And it's by paying attention to that and asking, so what does this mean for our culture? And minimum specifications exist already, and people do make minimum specifications, as was pointed out. They make them collectively as a shared understanding. So it's in bringing people together, the The work involves bringing people together to make shared specifications, to agree on them, and then to implement them. So I think it's really important. Glenda, do you want to add something about this?
No, thank you. I think you touched it very closely. All of those are indeed variations to look at. And the reason why, as in realist evaluation, we have to think about different things work for different places in different ways in different times. Culture is a great example.
So, so I think this is a good stage for to just jump in and then turn it back to you, Akiko, in terms of what TUFH hopes to do. So we've kind of put this, this is what was distributed, but we hope to do this with the global and regional associations, such as Beyond Flexner and Wonka and Amy and others who are here. But really, we thought the best we could provide value to the system is provide a platform that fosters dialogue, learning, creation of new knowledge, and really create this community of practice within this complex system thinking. Our thought, the way we do this, again, collectively, is we take some of the experts, which include people like Stuart and Akiko and others, who have kind of done this work, maybe on a global or regional or country level, and in a sense, create a platform for sharing this in a scope and sequence. And I'll show you that below. But really, as I think what came out through the story, through this dialogue, was to also say we want to bring in the local actors to share their stories. Because we can learn best by when we learn what happened on the ground and who was successful or not successful and what led to that success. And so by bringing these communities together, we've basically taken this complex system thinking, and then that led to capacity at local groups. So it's a very simple thought in terms of what we're thinking, but we thought, collectively, we could start by creating this scope and sequence. We have some people lined in here, like Akiko could do the economic case. Policy mapping gets a little bit in terms of managing the politics of it all. Stuart, in a sense, just did this introduction, but really pulling yourselves into this conversation as these experts and kind of filling this out, and then putting a call out to all of our networks on themselves and saying who has stories or community practices that would then combine with ourselves. We did have a starting framework of, say, where this could be applied, and we do have FAMER's regional institutes, and we have TUFH's regions, which we've been strengthening, but we also have your associations. So that's briefly at least our initial thoughts. We didn't want to start it until we actually had this chance to convene all of us and say, does this collectively make a collective goal together and move forward with that? So Akiko, I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Of course, Lionel, please jump in if you have comments and suggestions as we go into the discussion phase. We welcome from you some of the your responses, the initial responses, and on how we want to go forward in defining what we see as the shortcomings of our existing global health or national governance structure and addressing complex problems, and how can we commit towards learning about complex systems thinking and applying them towards the way we do work, but in the process avoid sort of retreating back into our areas of comfort, but using this network as a way to reach out into your zones of discomfort to find a new way of looking at solutions. So what we'd like to do is to have those of you with your ideas and suggestions on these questions on the screen there, and have our initial round of discussions. And as as Nick mentioned, this is part of the process. So we welcome you to continue thinking about this and contribute to this group and let it become part of the adaptive solution. So we're continuously learning and exchanging, and of course, find new ways of interacting and finding solutions. Lionel, would you have anything to add, to say to this?
I think Lion stepped away from the call. He just left a message.
Oh, people like to raise, anybody like to raise your hand with your thoughts on this? Any suggestions how we can agree on some of the critical shortcomings?
Akiko, when you're talking about existing government structures, are you talking about this group of people? Maybe just say a little bit more about that first question.
Sure. We may have different interpretations, but shortcomings of the governance, I was thinking, for example, from not so much the network itself, but where you see it in your own work context, where you see governance failures in making this connection at different levels. So in my case, for example, having worked on the international and national levels, the tendency to do top-down with the experts of various sorts giving advice without really understanding what is on the ground, despite the fact that we make the minimum requirements to understand the bottom up, and yet the structure governance didn't incentivize or didn't allow for that kind of dialogue. So that's an example of where I see a shortcoming in both the global as well as the national structure in more adaptive thinking as opposed to a more hierarchical, which tends to be the pattern of finding solutions because it's easier and simpler to find those solutions. That's just an example. So I don't know if that helps to clarify, but Stuart, you had some comments you wanted to add to that.
Well, I think it's really important as you go through the next series of presentations in the task forces to keep in mind these basic concepts of complexity as we move through all of these other processes, to not lose track of where we began today.
Yes, thank you. Keeping in mind what are the main goals, objectives of why we're doing this in the first place. So what? So what is this all about? Thank you.
I think it's about healthy people is what it's about.
And Akiko, I'd very much like to hear from a lot of the leaders of the associations. So maybe Vince and Trevor.
Yeah.
It looks like John's trying to wave his hand at us.
Oh, yes. Sorry, I can't get the.
Okay, sorry. I was trying to actually contact you before Nick spoke, actually, Akiko. Can I bring this down to a very basic level? And this reminds me of 37 years as a family physician in a rural area. I think family medicine is actually very much complex problems. And it's managing complex problems. It's about dealing with the community. It's not about the pathology and the illness. It's about a lot of things. And Stuart, I enjoyed your talk. I think one of the problems is that complexity drives specialization. And in fact, you know, when you specialize, things become vertical thinking. People start working in silos. So with the change, we also need to kind of to go back to more of a generalist approach to things. You know, a generalist approach allows you to look at the context, look at the various issues, look at the other points that are happening all around you. So I just wanted to say that I think that family medicine very much has been about generalism, and I think that we can look at other problems, and specifically rural problems, with the same lens.
Thank you, John. I think that really hits primary care and dealing with not patients, but as people and the communities is a critical entry point, which is where a lot of the complexity issues are not adequately addressed, whether at the physician level or at the payment level. I dealt with a lot of payment incentives, which are blunt instruments. And instead of helping the primary care to work as a team, it often undermines it. And we keep playing around with it, but because we don't really treat it as a complex problem, we end up bludgeoning it with 10 million different payment systems. I can tell you capitation, fee for service, all that. forgetting that financial incentive is only a small part important. And that kind of narrow-mindedness, although you may still need someone who thinks about financial systems, yes, that's part of it, but bringing it together on the ground and solving it through a common lens of what are we trying to do. I think we often forget that. Easier said than done. And it requires considerable discipline to talk across and not talk your own language. We end up becoming tribes in our little expertise domains. Economists talk their economic language, and medical professions, sorry, but you also talk it's very clinical, don't understand patients, and talk about patient care, and yet patients are the last people you ask because, well, you know, they don't really understand diseases. You know, these attitudes get repeated. So how do we break through that? But how do we then have it reflected? In my case, at the macro level, how do we go to scale on it? Because it's manageable at the smaller scale. I certainly have difficulties in figuring out how do you go to scale. And this is where we start to see patterns of social behavior that tends to replicate itself. And we need to pay attention to that. And we lose that because we go too narrowly and deeply. We need to learn to step back. But we don't do that because we're too busy, we're overloaded, we're burned out. Not doctors are that way, but economists are also burnt out. So then we lose a lot in the process, which means structurally there's a problem. That's where I hope that we can have a dialogue in each of you with your particular valuable experience. What can you bring from your perspective, but also then making that reach out? So John, you as a rural physician, you know the tremendous challenges. But from your perspective, what nugget of insights can you bring to an economist like myself?
Okay. I think the first thing that I was a rural physician, but I worked in a team of other carers, you know, cross-sectional, cross-sectoral, cross-professional. So I think it's about that cross-party working. I've always referred to the teams that we work with as complex teams because we deal with complexity. And I think that that's the important thing. It's building those complex teams on the ground. It's about it's about what people can do rather than what degrees or what qualifications. It's about competence. It's about the teams on the ground having its own dynamic, being able to develop itself to meet the needs of those communities.
Yes, right.
John, I'd like to just quickly respond to John and Akiko. John, the most complex work we can do is primary care in a community level, absolutely without a doubt. And I think primary care is the most complex form. And by working together, we develop shared interests and shared goals, and we use connections. And secondly, the question of minimal specifications helps us bridge from global to middle to local. We don't get lost along the way. And scaling, there's a problem of how we think about scaling. If you have a solution in one place and you want to make it work in other places, you're trying to scale it up. If you have minimum specifications and the local, mid-level, and global people all are working from the same specifications, then you are at scale. And you don't need to scale up, because what is at scale are the minimal specifications, and the interpretations of those are individually, but the global pattern is specified by the minimal specifications as they occur individually.
Thank you. I notice, Trevor, I think we missed you last time. You have your hand up.
Yeah, I was just following on from what was saying about primary care, and I think it's a really good example of how we've tried to address some of those complex issues, but I think we've forgotten that we're also in a complex world, and sometimes we feel as though we're killing too many crocodiles rather than draining the swamp, which is the right answer. And it's a complex situation in a complex world, and people keep moving the goalposts. And I think that's how I find people who get incredibly frustrated in some of the countries that I work in, is that as soon as somebody sets some standards, and Stuart quite ably talked about standards very early on, that those standards move in this complex world of ours, and you've only got to have a look at the types of people that we're seeing now in primary care to recognise that. So the concept of being dynamic, two dynamic situations working not always together, but in opposition sometimes causes an increased amount of complexity. Interesting to hear Stuart's thoughts on that.
I think that family medicine is complex because they see the maximum variety and variability, and they actually respond to it. So what really drives the interactions in complexity is inquiry. The ability to stay in inquiry, to be curious, to ask, what do I see, what's going on? And to ask, what does this mean for me? What does this mean for the family? What does this mean for the village? What does this, and to move up the orders of magnitude, always saying, so what does this mean across the entire scale, all the scales? And in this way, you never lose track of the big picture. So you could see what has meaning is made clear. What's interpreted is within individual contexts, but the scale of meaning stays connected all the way across. So I think it's really important what you say, Trevor. I think individual patterns drive decision-making, and staying connected across them, across contexts, and using adaptive action by asking what, so what, and now what at every level allows us to see the pattern that emerges across levels.
We have Vince. Vince would like to just add some comments to the conversation.
Sure. Yeah, no, this has been a really interesting discussion, and I think just a couple of thoughts. One, we work more on the macro level that Akiko was speaking of earlier, and on multilateral advocacy, U.S. government advocacy, but we're advocating for something that's very much at the local level. So it's the challenge there, I think, also is really one to put. I think it's imperative, and one thing that can be pushed on without creating a whole lot of new structures is continually pushing that against the thought of one person or a couple of people speaking for all of civil society or speaking for all of communities. And I think that that's one thing that we can continue to push regardless. But I think the challenge is creating those concrete pathways. Just in listening today, I mean, the complexity of what we're trying to address here is really kind of comes up against the thought of the more complex, or something even is perceived to be, the less likely that people are going to stay engaged in something. And so I think, creating some concrete pathways in some ways have to be simple, but then that simplicity makes it difficult. But I was thinking about the kind of structure that the civil society structure that the HIV/AIDS community has done, and it's had some of its faults, but it at least set up a structure that not only was about trying to have some of the global policies be made more effective or more adaptive to local needs, but that there was these mechanisms and concrete pathways from the local level on up for civil society participation. And I mean, I think one of the other things also is just to think about, like, we have a lot of societies and federations in this group, and oftentimes when we hear from them, we hear from the heads of those societies or federations. How can you get voices that are outside of that in a structure that is fair? I mean, I think that we've tried to get frontline health worker voices, for example, at global policy forums, but you know, just to be honest, it's not exactly a fair or like you know, fully fair system. And so I know that like sometimes to try to get the perfection is sometimes gets in the way of trying anything. But I think so. I think that a lot of the elements that you have here are good. I think the only question that I had on the paper there is just some of the working groups are obviously very interrelated to each other, like the community health, the primary health, rural health. Those things are very interrelated, and so how would the working groups kind of work together? So there's a lot of disparate thoughts there, but those are some of the things I was thinking about as I was listening.
But thank you. I know we're running a little bit short on time, but I have to say something. You know, this is very much a network represented by the medical community, and I feel that. So I wanted to push you all a little bit and say, we talked about primary care, family medicine, which is an important entry point, an important element. But these days we're going beyond that into much more of social care, linking up with the full range of care that goes beyond the clinical and the medical and even public health. And I just wanted to reflect on what Dr. Sugishita was saying about moving into more of the social determinants. That area is also an important aspect that I find, it's talk about it, but it needs, I think, a stronger push, particularly in this network that may have less of a social context, psychosocial groups that are involved in this. And I just wanted to briefly invite Dr. Sugishita maybe say a few words, because JICA, particularly amongst the various international or national organizations, really work at the micro and tend to do community health, although I think they have difficulties in going to scale, as Dr. Sugishita knows. Dr. Sugishita, would you like to take a few words on that to bring that perspective? You're on mute.
Oh, yes, sorry. We are working on different communities all over the world, but also we are facing challenges for kind of culture and social variations, and which also we have to admit ourselves for their well-being, notion of well-being, notion of life and death, notion of also sickness or diseases. So really we are tailor-made in approach to articulate their own values for life. But in terms of problem in Japan, it's a big problem, okay? Special primary health care, because all people are much, you know, pressurized the role which we have to play. That's why patients themselves, actually the value is quite different from their inner voices, inner value. So that is a big problem, which how we can interact to those people who want to be a well-being. However, we pressurize them to be a, you know, standard role for the society. So that is a really gap has started. I'm taking my parents in an elderly home now, but really I want to take care of them with my home, which I have to afford to have them with me, but it's very difficult, the cost and also my work. So this is not my value. So it's quite, you know, we have to look at value which are really real value for the individual, how we can take up that idea into the action. So that's a really challenge for me.
Thank you. Indeed, the issue of health and well-being is going beyond healthcare into psychosocial well-being, a meaning in life, as you say, values. This is something that is really becoming, coming to the forefront, and I think it requires a multidisciplinary approach and going beyond primary care into a broader care and well-being and respect of those communities and families we serve. So how do we integrate that into the way we operate will be a major challenge. Nick, I know that we are coming close to the end of time. And I know many people have, there are chats, exchanging views on the chats. And as Nick mentioned, this is just the start of what we hope will be a continuing conversation as we reach out to each of you and see how you could contribute to this discussion and dialogue as we move forward to enrich it and to learn from each other. So Nick?
Just final words. So thank you everyone for joining us. I think this was really the catalyst for a larger global movement, but in follow-up from those of you who have indicated interest, we'll follow up with, back with you, and then hopefully collectively we can launch something probably latter part of January or early February, and then invite people across the globe to participate in this process that will probably be a scope and sequence in terms of and getting people to join in on this conversation in a storytelling type of way. But with that, I'll reach out to you individually, but this is really a great indication of who's interested in this. So thank you for coming, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Stuart, for your presentation, everyone for your active participation. All the best.